Hello, I'm Matt Lampert,
Greetings, I'm Robert Folsom.
and welcome to Pop Trends Price Culture, the video cast about mood and markets. Today we're going to tackle mood, markets, and music.
Matt, that's right. Over the past year or so, the Socionomist has presented socionomic stories about the careers of some of the most popular American musicians and performers of the 20th century: Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, James Brown, and Chuck Berry. Now, their individual stories have all been told many times, but today we're gonna zoom out and consider them collectively because together they reflect the influence of social mood on the markets and on pop culture.
They really do, and if you've read those stories in the Socionomist, then you're going to be ahead of the curve. But if not, don't worry, you can jump right in. There are no prerequisites for this socionomic pop music history lesson.
Which is to say, no prerequisites aside from the core premise that social mood influences social trends and that the stock market is our best indicator of social mood. And the common threads and trends in this larger story of these four individuals, it's all a witness to that.
Yeah, and if you can follow that much, then you're going to be able to track this conversation today just fine.
Okay, so should we begin with the chapter that any good story about rock and roll history often tells, drugs in jail?
Hey, if we're going to go there, let's go. Sure.
Okay, in the late 1940s, the stock market was putting the finishing touches on what was a 20-year correction, and a teenage James Brown found himself serving 3 years for theft. A teenage Chuck Berry was arrested for armed robbery. A teenage Ray Charles was reportedly already using heroin. And usually in the turbulent lives of musicians, the drug abuse and the arrests come later once they have some career success. But in these cases, the trouble actually precedes that.
Yeah, it does. And what's so interesting is that this story starts with a negative extreme in social mood. So we get some of these rough times right off the bat.
Right. The only one of the bunch who'd had recording success during the 1940s bear market, that was Ray Charles, or before, I should say, he was a solo artist. He played piano and sang for the McSun Trio. And this group had a 1949 hit with Confession Blues, and it went to number 2 on the R&B chart.
Yeah, and that song, it's really different from a lot of the stuff he would end up doing just a few years later. This was a slow blues song. It was about the loss of a relationship, but that vibe was in sync with this negative social mood at the end of a 20-year negative mood trend. But the bear market would ultimately come to an end in 1949, and as the bull market of the 1950s took off, so did the careers of these early rock and roll pioneers.
Exactly. And in 1954, the Dow finally surpassed its 1929 peak. And mind you, this was the Dow's first all-time high in 25 years. And in the subsequent time, from 1954 through about 1957, these artists had an unbelievable, remarkable success on the music charts. From 54 through 1957, Ray Charles reeled off 14 straight top R&B singles. In 1955-56, Chuck Berry had 6 straight R&B top 10 hits. And in 1956 alone, Elvis Presley had 5 singles that went to number 1, 2 number 1 albums, and a number 1 EP. In 1957, Elvis had 4 more number 1 singles, 2 more number 1 albums, and 3 number 1 EPs, not to mention Elvis's iconic TV performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956 and 57, plus 3 movies: Love Me Tender, Loving You, and Jailhouse Rock.
What an incredible run. It's almost like in these 2 years, Elvis has like at least 2 or 3 careers worth of success. I mean, this is his social mood is surging toward the positive. It's just amazing. And all of these guys are releasing career-defining hits. I mean, for Chuck Berry, that's Johnny Be Good. For Ray Charles, it's I Got a Woman. James Brown's career ends up really hitting its stride a bit later, but even during this period, he did manage to score his first hit in 1956 with the song Please, Please, Please.
Alas, the positive mood trend, it was interrupted. And as the socionomists put it, the stock market hit a speed bump in late 1957, and in 1958, recession followed. In turn, we saw a corresponding change in fortune for our musicians. Elvis was drafted into the Army. He served for 2 years. And after James Brown's Please, Please, Please hit, none of his 9 follow-up singles made the charts. Ray Charles, who had a knack for shifting his style to stay in harmony with mood, he adapted to the more subdued times by releasing a pair of jazz albums.
Yeah, Ray is really remarkable. And of course he didn't know about socionomics, but what you might call his socionomic intuition was really good. And we'll see another example of that in a moment. But finally, this correction comes to an end. The market does end up rallying from mid 1958 through late 1959, and that resurgence in positive mood creates another window of opportunity for these more upbeat artists. James Brown has his first R&B #1 with the song "Try Me." Chuck Berry has 5 singles make the R&B chart in 1959 alone. Elvis, he's still in the Army, but nevertheless, he has 3 #1 hits in 1958-59 because his record label had stockpiled some material to release while he was in uniform. And Ray Charles, he pivots right back to upbeat with the mood trend and has one of his biggest hits with What I Say.
So after that sharp leg up, the market was choppy from about 1960 through October 1962. And volatility in social mood meant volatility in the markets, culture, and beyond. For example, the period included some of the most unforgettable moments of the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the construction of the Berlin Wall. And this volatility, it also rippled into the careers of our musicians. Elvis's music, it remained on the music charts, but in 1961, he decided to stop performing live shows. And Chuck Berry was convicted of violating the Mann Act, which was often selectively enforced. And he did have to serve a prison sentence in 1962, 1963.
Yeah, so we see this negative mood trend, and Chuck Berry, goes back to jail just like he was in the negative mood trend of the 1940s. Now, one who managed to capitalize on the volatility of the early 60s was Ray Charles. That correction in 1960 to 62 in the markets, it took a classic 3-wave form. And during the first wave down, Charles releases the mellow, soulful Georgia on My Mind, which, being a Georgia native, kind of a classic around here. And it ends up being his first song to go to #1 on the pop chart. And then during the rally, he pivots right back to upbeat. He has a run of 3 up-tempo singles, including Hit the Road Jack, which also goes to #1. But then during that final leg down, he makes one of the most inspired, socionomically attuned career moves I've ever heard of anyone doing. And Robert, you can do the honors of telling us about what that was.
Well, what it was epic. In 1962, Ray Charles, he released a pair of country albums. Now, starting in the 80s and 1990s, country music did adopt a pop-oriented sound, and that remains part of the genre today. But back in the early 60s, country was filled with lyrics about sadness and heartbreak and hard times, and it was like the soundtrack to the struggles of the white working class. It's been called the white man's blues, and Ray Charles understood the overlap between country and the blues, and he said something that's just fantastic. It's good enough to actually read the quote. "I think the words, the country songs, are very earthy, like the blues, see, very down. They're not as dressed up, and the people are very honest and say, 'Look, I miss you, darling, so I went out and got drunk in this bar.' That's the way you say it. Wherein Tin Pan Alley would say, 'Oh, I missed you, darling, so I went to this restaurant and I sat down and had dinner for one.' That's cleaned up now, you see. But country songs and the blues is like it is," end quote. Modern sounds in country and Western music became like his first #1 album. The lead single itself went to #1 on the pop and R&B charts, meaning it was a crossover smash that expressed negative mood at the end of a market correction.
Yeah, that's such a great story. And after that 1962 low, there's an about face in the mood trend. Positive mood comes roaring back. The stock market blasts off and would soar into 1965, 1966. And this run ends up being a more interesting time than I would have expected. I mean, socionomically, you might think, well, we have these artists, a lot of them who do well in positive mood. We've got this big positive mood trend. So what is there to say other than that it was really a quite prosperous time? But it ends up being there ends up being more to it, and I think you especially see it, Robert, with what happens to Elvis during this time.
Right. We mentioned that Elvis stopped doing live performances in 1961, and that was in order for him to devote himself full time to his movie career. His movies were very successful. Before 1966, each one of his soundtrack LPs charted in the top 10. And so his decision to use his time in Hollywood meant that Elvis spent the most powerful years of the bull market, not as an iconic performer on stage, but as an actor in what today we might charitably describe as B films.
Yeah, it's just true that critics universally pan the music he recorded for those soundtracks in the mid '60s, especially by the time he gets to the end of the Hollywood years. Some of that material you got to hold your nose when you listen to it, but he is commercially successful with some sacrifices, as you were saying, Robert, some sacrifices on the artistic side. Whereas someone who played that burst of positive mood differently was James Brown, who in the mid 60s just really leans in and hits his artistic zenith. This was his era where he's releasing Out of Sight, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, It's a Man's World, and of course his career defining hit, I Got You. I mean, hey, I feel good and I knew that I would. That's positive mood.
Yeah. Also, in the run up to the 1966 bull market peak, Ray Charles had his final top 10 album of his career in 1964, and he also scored his last R&B #1 single for nearly a quarter century with "Let's Go Get Stoned." And the irony of that title was he released the song right after he had reportedly kicked his heroin habit. But you get a hint in the title song, the song title, I should say, that mood was in transition again to the negative side.
Yeah, you do, and we really have to make a distinction here between the correction that happens in the markets after that 1966 peak and the corrections that we've talked about so far. I mean, this correction ends up being quite long. The Dow PPI is going to be in a bear market from 1966 to 1982. This is 16 grueling years, and it ultimately would prove to be a storm too strong for any of these guys to weather. But as we know, these mood trends, they're a process. So mood doesn't go from peak positive to peak negative overnight. There's a falling transition, and that transitional period allowed for some pockets of lingering success, and those pockets tended to come near rally highs within that correction.
Right. And after the 66 peak, Elvis's soundtrack sales, they go in the tank. His highest charting soundtrack album was Clam Bake, and that was 1967. It peaked at number 40. And that was very different than what had preceded his soundtrack sales. Elvis also released a gospel album that year, and it actually earned Elvis his first Grammy.
Yeah, so already we're starting to see this dichotomy, this mixed mood showing up where he's winning a Grammy, but the album sales aren't doing as well on the chart. And as you say, I mean, there are still some wins here. James Brown during this time is still headlining. He's playing Madison Square Garden. He's making his debut on the Ed Sullivan Show. Ray Charles has a couple more songs that make the charts. And for Chuck Berry, the wheels come off that train a little bit earlier. His last charting single for a number of years ends up coming a bit earlier in 1965. But during a counter trend rally in 1968, the one who probably makes the most of that is Elvis with his comeback television special.
Right. Analysts refer to the early years of the stock market correction as a triple top. The original high in 1966, and then two subsequent rally highs in 1968 and early 1973. Elvis's comeback special, it was his first live stage performance since 1961, and it aired on television on the day of the 1968 rally high. And it relaunched his live performing career. He went on to do tours, a series of shows in Las Vegas. He released a documentary, and he won a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Then in January 1973, the month of the Dow's triple top, Elvis's Aloha from Hawaii concert was broadcast via satellite to viewers and fans in 36 countries.
Talk about great timing with those two TV specials. They're right at those rally highs. And speaking of that January 1973 rally peak, in the months preceding that top, as the Dow was screaming higher, suddenly Chuck Berry's career comes snapping back to life just for a moment, and he has the only pop #1 song of his career. And I hesitate to say the song title, Robert. Please don't shoot the messenger. But the song was called "My Ding-a-ling," and you imagine that double entendre was fully intended.
Yeah, I could have told you that because, I was one of the new generation of music lovers who was introduced to Chuck Berry kind of by that song. And believe it or not, I remember it. I was in high school at the time. Don't ask me how he managed to play. I want you to play with my ding-a-ling, and do it with a straight face. I don't know. A clip of the live performance is on YouTube. But after the 1973 high, things got tough. And the only one of the artists we're talking about to successfully lean into the negative mood surge in 73, 74, that was James Brown. His December 73 release, titled The Payback, it had revenge themes. It went to #1 in the R&B charts. The next year in 74, he had an album titled Hell. And that name speaks for itself regarding negative mood. It yielded 2 more R&B #1 hits.
Yeah. When I think of James Brown, what comes to mind is often just his stage show. I mean, he's such an energetic, high octane performer, but he did have a side to him that was not afraid to go toward the darker themes, and it ends up working out for him really well at the time of this nominal low in the stock market in 1974. But as the bear market continues on a PPI adjusted basis, none of these guys end up coming out well. I mean, by the end of the bear market, Elvis is dead. Chuck Berry goes back to jail. Ray Charles and James Brown end up losing their recording contracts. And just it looks so dire. But then the bull market of the 1980s unfolds, and it's like none of these bad times ever happened.
And it was extraordinary to see how their careers turned around. Presley Brown, Ray Charles, and Chuck Berry, they were all among the first class of inductees to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. Brown, Charles, and Berry each won Grammy Lifetime Achievement Awards during the 1980s or 1990s. Ray Charles transitioned into the positive mood with another country album in 1984. It went to #1 in the country charts, this time with a pop country sound. And in 1990, he had his first R&B #1 single since 1966. In 86, James Brown had his first top 10 hit on the pop chart since 1968, and in 1987, Brown won his first competitive Grammy since 1966.
Yeah, that was for living in America. And you see the return of the strongest positive mood trend since the 1960s, correspondingly producing the strongest career accolades for these musicians since the 1960s. And as this bull market continues into the 1990s, but now these guys are getting a little older, they're not necessarily releasing a ton of new music, but they remained active as live touring performers. I mean, Chuck Berry's playing dozens of dates each year, just about across Europe and North America during this time. James Brown actively and profitably toured. And Ray Charles was still playing shows even the year before he died.
Right. And Charles's final album was released posthumously in 2004, and it went to #1, earned 8 Grammys. Chuck Berry, just before his death in 2017, just before he died, he completed his first album since 1979. And Matt, let's not forget, even though Elvis didn't live to see the large degree bull market of the past 40 years, his music remains relevant. Graceland opened to the public in the 1980s. It remains a huge tourist attraction. And a compilation of Elvis's hits went to #1 in 2002. Just last year, a movie about his life became the second highest grossing music biopic of all time.
Yeah, and there's some socionomically intriguing curiosities about the timing of some of those events and Elvis's kind of cultural resurgences over the years, as well as many other interesting socionomic details about the careers of these artists that we didn't get into today. But you can find all of those details and more in our profiles of these musicians in the Socionomist, and you can get all of those issues as well as just about everything else we produce here at the Socionomics Institute when you become a Socionomics Premier member. Robert, let's wrap things up for today. To the viewers, thank you for watching. As always, you can get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. The email address is institute@socionomics.net. That's institute@socionomics.net. Robert, thank you for this conversation. Let's talk again soon.
It was a blast, Matt. Thank you.